Hello, and welcome to this very first new Guide Vision podcast. We are today here to discuss about itSMF conference, which happened yesterday. And I have here Kaimar Karu with me.
Hello.
Hello. And Kaimar, you are former ministry in Estonia. And you have done quite much different kind of topics. I think that many persons will remember you, for example, from time that you did at Axelos and you were leading those book writings.
Mm-hmm.
But we have met actually first time, or more than 10 years ago.
More than 10 now, yes.
Yes, and you were in that time president of itSMF Estonia.
Correct.
And you organized your conference in that year, 12th of December, and year was 2012.
Yeah, 12, yes.
That was a very remarkable day and easy to remember. And so we are that way. We started to do the cooperation also with itSMF, and that leads to this itSMF Czech Republic conference this year. And you had your presentation there. And but before we go to your presentation topic, would you like to tell a little bit more about your role, what you currently do, and what kind of role you have now?
Sure. So yes, as you mentioned, I've been involved in IT service management and ITIL for quite some time. So at one point, I also worked for Axelos. I was leading the strategy and development for ITIL and Prince2 and other products as well. And I've kind of used IT service management frameworks and techniques and methods and so on for quite some time in consultancy. So right now, I'm also working as a consultant. I'm working with different organizations around the world, helping them mostly to essentially navigate complexity, to become better at sense making, to become better at decision making. So working with leaders, helping them to make decisions when, let's say, in situations where there's not enough information. So how do you make a decision there? How do you move forward? But also in situations where you have too much information. So there's lots of noise and you need to figure out what is important, what is not important, and how to work with the teams in the organization to essentially to make change sustainable. So it's not just about, let's say, the banner of sustainability, but also everything that is under this. So how do we approach change in the organization in a sustainable way? How to make sure that changes actually stick, rather than are something which works well for one individual's career development. So yes, I introduced that change, and then I left before everybody knew that it doesn't work. So how not to do that, but how to focus on actually making things work in the organization.
Yes. Thanks a lot of this. And yesterday your presentation, the header was organization stagnation yeah. And change don't stick. And in that presentation, what would you like to say that is the main message of the presentation within the couple of sentences?
Oh, with a couple of sentences. Okay, so that's a little bit shorter than the 30 minutes that I had yesterday. So one thing I would say that they mentioned it yesterday as well. So very often when people in organizations, when they embark on some kind of change or when they want to kick off a change initiative, they very often focus on trying to change the people. And they don't think about the system. So they think that, well, people can be changed. So if we tell them to start behaving in a different way, they will listen to us, they will understand why, and then essentially from tomorrow or from next week, they will start behaving in a completely different way. And it never works. Well, first of all, people don't want to be changed. Well, we all know that. We don't want to be influenced in a way that, well, you need to do it differently now. Like, I know better, you need to do it differently. So that doesn't work that well. And usually, I think there's a challenge of misaligned incentives in organizations. So people, they choose the path of doing their work, which seems to make most sense to them. And if you want people to start behaving differently, it's not about changing the people, but it's about changing the context or the environment where they work, to make the desired behaviors easier for them and the undesired behaviors more difficult. But it's about working with the system, and when you work with the system, you need to understand that there's, whenever you change something, whenever you try to change the course of things, there will be effects which you cannot foresee. So the kind of unforeseeable consequences of your actions, they always come to play. So in the organization, you have to focus on making the organization more resilient, because change is not just change initiatives which have been approved by the management. Your management probably does not approve your competitor launching a new product, or the legislation changing in one of the countries that you operate in. So this is not in the domain of influence for your management. So changes will affect you in various ways all the time, and you have to make the organization resilient enough to be able to deal with those. And then once you become more resilient, it also becomes easier for you to introduce kind of changes in the system to make it easier for people to behave in ways that you believe are good. But it's not enough for the manager to think, well, they should do it like this. First of all, how does the manager know? Right? If they're not actually doing the work, so do they really know better than the people who actually do the work? And then the question is, well, so yeah, first, like, how do you know? And second, how do you explain it to people? How do you, like, you can't just go to adults and tell them, well, you are doing it wrong. I know better. You should do it this exact way as I tell you. It's like, no. So there is quite a lot of aspects that you need to keep in mind. So you have to, essentially, it's a lot less about pushing and a lot more about enablement. So enabling the change to happen, the change that you want to introduce, but then, as I said, kind of increasing the resilience to deal with the change that happens regardless of what your strategy is or your plans are, just because of the things that happen around the organization.
How much do you think that from these changes, that when they doesn't happen or when they are done and there has been, for example, done in the way that there has been consultant who has helped during doing the change, and but it hasn't yet been transferred to daily operation, how much you think or have seen that is contractually so, that it hasn't been confirmed that it comes at the daily operation, or is there something that we could do, like a contractually, to improve this situation?
I think that there's a deeper issue with how consultancy works in many cases, and what it is that you buy as a customer from the consultancy company. So do you buy outputs or outcomes? And can you even buy outcomes, let's say? So as a consultant, so if the role for the consultant is to deliver something, some, let's say, piece of documentation or a model for a new process, or perhaps training your people, whatever it might be, there's no guarantee that any of those things will actually deliver the outcomes that the organization expects. They might improve certain things, they might not improve certain things. Well, if you write process documentation and nobody then uses this, has it improved anything or not? Probably not, right? So what it is that we actually ask from consultants to deliver, and how much power do the consultants have to impact the outcomes of what they do? So if the management hasn't communicated the strategy across the organization, if there are no clear and shared principles across the organization, if it's unclear what the priorities are, what are strategic activities which are not strategic activities, that division, if there's not enough resources to manage all the work that people have been given. So with these kinds of issues, a consultant can point out that, well, you have issues here and here and here, but they're not necessarily the ones who can change anything about it. So can they be held responsible for the change sticking in the organization or not? I would say that in most cases, well, they can't be held responsible for that because it's not in their power to make it stick. And then, of course, we get to the question, like, why do we want to use these consultants then? Very often what happens is a consultant comes in and puts together a slide deck with recommendations. At least half of those recommendations are something that people in the organization already know, because they have been proposing those for years and being completely ignored. But management might be happy with these nice and shiny slides, and they now execute a change program to implement all those changes, but they don't actually commit. Right? So they don't provide resources, they don't change the priorities of the rest of the work to allow people to do that. So you start perhaps with lots of energy, but it doesn't really get you anywhere. So contractually, there of course could be an issue in terms of, well, your role as a consultancy company is to deliver certain pieces of products or documentation or whatnot, and then you're not responsible for the rest because the contract has ended. But to make the change stick, I wouldn't say it's the consultant's responsibility, or it would be rare cases where it would be the consultant's responsibility. So the way I found that works when I work with my customers, I don't own their problems and I don't own their solutions. So the customer themselves, they have to own the problems and the solutions. And the role, this is something that Dave Snowden, the guy behind the Cynefin framework, has also mentioned or used the phrase of like the consultancy is like a midwife. So you're helping the organization, but it's not your baby. The moment you take ownership of the problems or the solutions, it's very easy for the company to shift the accountability from them and having to change something to you as a consultant. And then, of course, the consultant will kind of produce a report that the change program was extremely successful and requires these follow-up projects for the next 3 or 5 years, which might not actually be in the benefit or for the benefit of the company. So yes, the problem should be owned by the company, the solution should be owned by the company, and the consultant's role is to help the organization do those things, but not take responsibility for achieving it. Yeah.
Yeah. How about, have you seen the cultural differences a lot? If there are different behavior in different countries, or even more the cultural differences between the different companies, does that affect to this? And do we have, for example, companies whose culture is so ready that they can even do this organization change management activities with their own employees and own resources?
Like I wouldn't say that using consultancies is in any way bad for an organization. So very often you don't necessarily have the experience in the organization already, or you have different options and then you need to choose between them, and consultant can help you with that to point out what could work best and what might not work well for you. So in that sense, I wouldn't really say that, well, it's a better culture if you can do it on your own. Because the risk with that is you don't listen to others and then you drown into your own little world without much connection to reality. The challenges with organizational change, I would say they're quite universal across the world. I worked less with companies in Asia and more, I would say, in the Western world. So in the Western world, at least, the challenges are similar. The culture in the organization, it's an emergent feature of the organization. So culture is not something that you buy, although some consultancy companies kind of try to sell you that culture as well. But you can't buy this, you can't implement this. It's something that emerges from the interactions between people and the way people are treated in that company. And of course, there are ways of working with people that are more reasonable or more efficient, giving them the freedom to make decisions, but also providing them with constraints. So if you give people too much freedom, it might become quite confusing because you don't know which way to go. If you don't clarify the strategic priorities, it's also very difficult for people to choose the path. So if you provide them with these enablers, so constraints the strategy, principles, and so on, and you give them the freedom to make decisions in their domains, that's essentially that would be an excellent first step or a series of steps to begin with. And then if you treat people with respect, if you don't assume that they want to destroy the company, but if you assume that they want to do the best job that they can, and if they don't perform to the level that you expect, it's not because they're bad or stupid or dangerous, but because the system that you have in place right now just does not support them. So as a manager, you need to figure out what you need to change in the organization to support people better. And that's part of this culture emerging. So collaboration between teams, for instance, sharing information, transparency, sharing tasks, perhaps. So when one team is overloaded, can another team help them with that or not? Is it encouraged or not? Are there incentives in place that kind of push or nudge people towards doing the right thing, or are there incentives in place which essentially tell people stay in your lane, do exactly as you're told, do not raise any questions or problems, and then of course like a hidden feature of that would be don't document anything, because once you document something you might be replaced, or whatever the fears are people have. So it is the enablers and constraints in the organization that help you with kind of creating this culture or letting the culture emerge, rather.
I have had even the experience that in one company, inside same company, we were doing changes in different part of the organizations, and a similar kind of changes, but within the same company happened that they had different culture between the different teams. How often have you seen this kind of behavior as well, that in one team that was they were ready to change, they were expecting, they were waiting for the change because they knew that that can bring something better for them, and another team was in fear of the change, and they resisted totally that, no, don't come here, don't do that change.
And of course it can happen, and in large organizations it's very normal for different teams or parts of the organization to have different approach to things, different fears and different habits. It is partially dependent on what they're responsible for. So if you're working with systems that are highly critical, you might have a very different approach to safeguarding those systems, let's say from changes and so on, to make sure that they're stable enough. If you start from the beginning, it might not make sense to keep changes away, because you need to make sure that it's, let's say, plastic enough and resilient enough. But if you're dealing with some kind of a legacy system, for instance, and it's difficult for you to change the underlying technology because the support is not given to you to do that, then it might feel that safeguarding something is the only way to keep it working. So you have a very, let's say, a team culture that is against change. Whereas in another team that doesn't deal with these kinds of issues, there might be an attitude where change is very, very welcome. So that's quite normal. What I've seen in the past also, especially when the agile methods came into development, some of the organizations, what they did was they had this, let's say, traditional software development teams that tried to use waterfall for things that are not really projects. So when you use project management for product development as the main method, it doesn't work, right? So you can have projects within the products, but you can't use one method to manage this. So teams like the traditional software development teams and then the new agile teams, right? And with the new agile, they had different rules. Like you can go and break things. You can move fast. There will be less controls that you need to follow. But what happened in many of those cases, these agile teams, yes, of course, they broke things because they were experimenting, which is fine. But what the organization hadn't thought about was when they break something, it doesn't break just for them, but it breaks also for all the other teams. So you got these teams that wanted to move very, very fast and were breaking everything around them which affected all the other teams as well. And that created kind of resistance to Agile. It's like, okay, so they are doing things that are affecting us negatively, so we don't want to do that. We want to keep doing the work the way we did before, and things like this. And also, I wouldn't say that the whole organization needs to have, let's say, but in quotes, right, so the same culture. Because different teams, different responsibilities, different objectives, beyond let's make money for the company, right? So your team is different than my team. So and the culture in those parts can differ. So that's not a problem. The problem is when different teams start working against each other because the incentives that they have in place force them to work against each other. And that's for the management to figure out why that is the case and remove these kinds of obstacles.
Yeah, and I have also seen several times situations that when it has been there has been a project and requested to do the change, and the project has ended, and that there has even been the situations that the same customer has requested the RFP after several 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Requesting a new project. And when you get the RFP, you even notice that, oh, this is exactly what we did for them. So they have went back to the previous behavior. The waste, what comes from here. How you would define this and how we could stop getting that waste.
Perhaps sometimes the challenge with bigger changes in organizations is the organizations haven't really figured out why they want to do these things. So they know that they have challenges. They know that they need to do something about that. And then they haven't been able to create the link between the problem or the challenge that they have and the potential solution. So they might start, let's say, implementing something or using something which, yes, it is a solution, but for a different problem. So they can't connect those things. Or if what they want to buy, consultancy or tooling or whatever it might be, which actually would help them with the challenge, then the problem could be that they haven't understood what the challenge is. So they're trying to maybe do some kind of local optimization. So they tweak something somewhere in the organization, but they haven't thought about what is the effect of that change for the rest of the organization. Like I mentioned, the Agile teams, right? So you tweak something, you allow Agile to be used there, which might be very reasonable, but you haven't thought about what is the effect of that on the rest of the organization and what you need to change in that organization to allow for the Agile team to succeed, but also not punish the other teams who are not currently using these methods, for instance. But also sometimes these change initiatives or transformations, right? Whatever the transformation is, Agile, DevOps, Lean, ITIL. Sometimes they're vanity projects. They're not really connected in any meaningful way to the organization's objectives. They're done, or let's say led by one person who wants to make a name for themselves. And the success of the project is less relevant than the appearance of success. So you almost pretend that you have done all those things, even though people haven't really changed their behaviors. You haven't changed anything meaningful in the system to help people change their behaviors, to support the new behaviors. But you have filled out some reports, you have created some presentations where you say that everything has been extremely successful, but nothing has actually been done. So in that case, for them to come back to you after a few years with a similar request or the same request is absolutely normal. You can't assume that you can't assume that when they come back to you, it's another vanity project. It might not be. But the reasons for why it didn't stick the last time, maybe not much was actually done beyond reports of everything being a huge success, as always.
Watermelon effect.
Yes.
How about these changes? Nowadays, organizations are forced to do also more sustainability decisions and do activities based on sustainable behavior. And that can be thought sometimes only as a cost. How we can get that kind of changes going through the organization when the organization itself, they understand the reason behind it, but thinking that it is just the cost still.
So there is a book which was published not last year, but at the end of the year before, in the ITIL book series that covers some of the aspects of digital sustainability. And there's quite a few recommendations on how to get started with that in the organization. The organization, of course, has to have some kind of a need for this, right? So if the organization doesn't understand that it's valuable, it's very difficult to introduce any approach, sustainability or not. But I would say that for most organizations, the case is that their customers and partners already require them to be more sustainable, to make commitments to become more sustainable, and also to demonstrate progress there. So, and it could also be legislation that requires things like this. So sustainability in general is becoming more and more something that is not really a choice that you have to make, but it's something that you have to approach in one way or another. And the question is, what might be the most successful way of addressing this? And of course, like one aspect there is, I would say that you shouldn't necessarily have a separate strategy for sustainability. Like you have the organizational strategy, you have maybe digital strategy, and then you maybe have a sustainability strategy as well. Unless you are a very well-functioning organization, there's a very high risk that these strategies are in no meaningful way connected. So in a way that if you pursue one of the strategies, it works against the others, including, so if you focus on sustainability, you're probably working against some of the other things that have been said in other strategies. So digital sustainability or sustainability in general should be made part of the main strategy. And as it is with many or perhaps all types of changes, for everybody involved, for all the stakeholders, you have to figure out the question to there, what's in it for me? So why should I care? What will change in the way I do my work? What will be the benefits for me and for my team? So you need to be able to answer that. And it requires support, again, as all the change initiatives, it requires support from top-level management, right? So you can't just introduce sustainability in terms of, well, you keep doing the work that you have been doing, more or less the same way, right? But in addition to everything, now do sustainability as well, which is completely disconnected from everything else. And it's additional work rather than changing some of the work that you do today. And when we talk about digital sustainability, I always mention two aspects of this. So first is to figure out how you can use digital technology to support the sustainability strategy and sustainability initiatives. There's many ways of doing that. For instance, moving to the cloud might be a better option than running your own data center. Not always, but it could be, for instance. Or figuring out what to do with older laptops. So just kind of stack them somewhere, or you do send them to recycling. Maybe you sell them to your employees for a lower price, whatever it might be. So it's not just the using or not using paper cups in the office, right? Or plastic forks and knives. So like which technologies you can use to support, but also for the existing technologies, are they themselves sustainable? So maybe you're using solutions that require a lot of electricity, and then you need to figure out whether your demand for electricity, like what's the source for the energy, right? Is it green or not green? So you might be saying that you're doing all these green things, but actually you're using all the non-green solutions for that. So it might look very nice, but doesn't actually deliver.
And also, yesterday during your presentation, you had one very strong message also within your presentation, and it was stop doing stupid things. And is there anything that you can share, like an example, which kind of stupid things are the worst that are like the most common ones that stops us to doing the correct way things?
So yes, so the message was strong in my presentation, and the reason for that, very often it might be difficult in the organization to agree on what is a better way of doing things. So when you start with that, so let's agree on this new way of doing things, you get lots of viewpoints, you get lots of discussions, and you might also get quite a lot of disagreements. So it might be difficult to move forward, especially if you don't have enough information or if you don't understand your context that well. So you don't know which way to go. So that might be a difficult starting point. Often the easier starting point is to look at what is being done today, and then getting people's opinions on, but also data, on what doesn't seem to be working, right? So what are the stupid things that you're doing right now? And agreeing on, well, this actually does feel stupid, is often easier than, yes, this actually is a better solution, right? So you start with kind of building consensus on we should stop doing that, and only then the next step is, okay, so what should we do instead of this? And then there are options, right? So it could be something that is already known, you just haven't got around to that before, or it could be something where you need consultants to help you, or it could be something that, well, you are in a unique situation, so no one really knows the answer. So perhaps you should experiment with a few options and see what seems to be most promising. So there are different options for what might happen next, but just kind of getting the, I would say, almost common understanding that there are certain things that are bad, we should stop doing those. And then it could be anything from the strategy side, so the kind of the stupid things that you do, or things that you stupidly do not do, like understanding your landscape, which is one. So understanding what is happening on the market around you and how different initiatives, changes on the market, what effect they do have and what effect they might have. What are the dependencies in your internal value chains, but also when let's say you probably depend on other companies delivering something, and some other companies depend on you delivering something, and there's competitors on the market who do the similar thing to what you do. So how do those forces on the market, how do they influence each other? So it's not just like how the services or how the goods flow through these organizations, but also if you change course or if part of the market changes course, like for instance, more organizations understand that sustainability is an important thing to think about, how will that affect their behaviors? And what opportunities might there be for you, or what risks for you? So if you're dependent on a partner that is operating in a non-sustainable way, then your product or service could also become non-sustainable for many of your customers. So you lose your customers. So you need to kind of understand those things. Communication could be another. So this is not really like, it's part of strategy as well, but not only strategy. It's do you listen to people? Do you observe how the work is really done? Or do you rely only on shiny reports, which are filtered many, many times? And perhaps like one of the main things is, have you learned how to ask the question why? Or why are you not asking the question why? So when certain things are done or being done, it's like, okay, so why do we do that? And why do we do it in that way? Like, is it okay in the organization to ask for those things? Or is the answer always, well, like, this is how we do things, or this is how we do it here?
or is the why quite often that we are just so used to?
Exactly, and like, so there are two questions, like should we do it like this, or should we do it at all? And when you think about all the procedures and processes and controls that have been put in place in the organization, how often does the organization go back and look at those and like, okay, are they still useful? Do they help us to achieve what we want to achieve? Or this is something that we have put in place at one time? No one even remembers why, but we keep doing them. But it's not to say that, well, if you don't understand why this is being done, just stop doing this, because that could be dangerous as well. So figure out why it was initially introduced and then see if it's still useful or not. So don't just go and demolish everything and then hope for the best. But yes, kind of understanding the landscape, understanding the context, not relying on direct observations, but relying on like very filtered reports, stuff like this.
How about then if we think the chain of smaller changes or big bang changes? Are there kind of differences how they are accepted into the organization?
Well, every big change consists of smaller changes anyway.
Yeah, exactly. But
Yes,
when they are introduced at the once or something,
so
from organization management point of view, that from the communication and does it comes, they are just informing us, they are just sending new newsletters or something when there are smaller changes happening all the time.
Well, as I said in the beginning, organizations should become more resilient to deal with the changes that affect them on a daily basis anyway. So change is not something which is like a extra to like normal work. There is no normal work. You deal with changes all the time. But for bigger types of changes or bigger changes in the direction, you need to be able to explain the direction, the change of direction to people in the organization. They need to know why you're doing these things, or why are you pushing for new ways of working? Why are you asking them to change their behavior? So that's part of the bigger change. But then you shouldn't continue with like a massive change program that doesn't really take reality into account. You often don't know how exactly you need to change the way teams work. You don't necessarily know which methods or tools are the best to achieve the objectives. So you should leave quite a lot of room to learn what works and what doesn't work. And those are all smaller changes.
And involvement from the members or those who are really doing the job.
Exactly. So don't assume that you know what your teams, like maybe 3 layers behind you, like what it is that they really need or what their challenges are in getting the work done. So they should have input to that, and they often really should have a decision-making capability as well for certain aspects of this. So don't push things on people, but allow them to pick up things that are useful. And of course, again, you can have constraints, so not everything is permitted. You can have constraints in terms of what is allowed, but also budgets or timelines. So those can be helpful. And then I mentioned principles before as well. So principles are extremely useful in organizations, kind of to be used all the time, essentially, because the team leaders, they always have decisions to make. And very often you have options, right? So once you have learned more about your context, you have options. So we could go that way. We don't necessarily know which behind door number 1, but that's an option. There's also door number 2 and door number 3. So how do you make a decision there? And when you open those doors, it's like, okay, so they all look reasonable. But how do you judge whether they look reasonable or not? So you use principles for that. It's like, okay, so we have agreed on these certain things. We have these kinds of values in the organization. These are the things that we do and do not do. These are the objectives. This is the strategy. Okay, so door number 2 does not work for us because it goes against some of our core principles. Door number 1 also doesn't work for us because it's not aligned with our values. It's not aligned with our objectives. So it leaves door number 3. We can't guarantee it will be successful, but based on everything that we know about that option, it seems currently the most reasonable one. So we go there.
So we saw yesterday also during the presentation one slide where was added much regulations on top of each other. And there was all the time just added more and more and more. So what do you think of that? That affects also to these changes. Some thoughts about that?
So there's a situation very often that where kind of top-level management is confused why things are not moving or not moving fast enough, because they have already told the people what should be done, and then those things are not being done. So like, what's the reason? And often one of the reasons is there's too many controls, too many blockers in the organization. So what happens very often is, well, something goes wrong, right? So as part of the normal operation or parts of a new change, so you don't want that to happen again. So you put in place some kind of limitations or controls to avoid that from happening again. And then again, and again, and again. So you put in place lots of controls and things that cannot or should not be done. So when a team or an individual, so when they want to start doing something in a different way, perhaps in a way that you ask them to do this, right? So they actually want to change their behavior. They believe that the new behavior is better. They know how to change the behavior and they want to do it. So change their practices, ways of working, change the processes. And they're enthusiastic and they come to the point where they need to actually make the change work, and then they can't because it's not allowed. And then they don't know who might be able to approve this, or the approval chain is very, very long and takes a long time. It's also confusing. It bounces back and forth. So even if they want to do something that was asked from them, there might be controls and limitations in place that don't allow them to do that. So the organization should go back every once in a while and look at the controls that they have, look at the rules that they have, and make sure that they don't come, like the teams when they want to do something, they don't come up to the intersection where all the lights are red and no one can move. So kind of what happens is lots of on an intersection, that would mean lots of cars are there, but no one is moving. So traffic jam, and you can create these, unfortunately, you can create these situations in the organization as well. So sometimes you need to figure out whether your traffic lights are actually working the way they should be working, or if it's always showing red. And connected to this, one of the key principles of change initiatives and let's say changing behaviors is to make sure that the new behavior requires less energy from the individuals, from the teams, compared to the previous ways of working. So as I mentioned at the very beginning, people choose ways of working which seem most reasonable for them, considering the context, limitations, and so on. So if you want people to go for the new way of working and abandon the previous way of working, you have to make it so that it consumes less energy. It has to be easier. And there's two aspects to that. One is you actually design this to be easier. You can't always do that. The new way of working might be more complicated or might require more time or more effort. So you look at the old way of doing things and you make that one to require more energy than it did before. So you still make the new one better than the old one. But it's not in the sense of manipulation. So it's not about, well, if you do it the old way, you will be punished. Not like this. But make the new way of working an obvious choice. And it could be an obvious choice even when it requires more effort. But people have understood why this makes sense. So doing it in a different way, even in a way that requires less effort, but because it goes against values, let's say, when it goes against the strategy, when it goes against the objectives of the organization, you wouldn't choose that. Why would you want to hurt yourself? It doesn't deliver what you need. So you choose the one that delivers what you need.
Also, the trust that they can, the trust is given and shared. And the confidence that people are really willing to do the better options and selections.
Yes.
Even it doesn't always feel like that, but it hasn't been notified in organizations, I would say.
Yeah, and most people, they don't want to do a bad job. So if you have teams of people who don't seem to be performing, then very likely it's not about those people, but it's about how and what you have asked from them and what you have given them as enablers and as support. So you need to change that. If you have a high-performing team and a low-performing team, so what is the difference? Are you saying that by accident, 20 people who are low-performing just by accident ended up in the same team? Like, how likely is that? And then 20 people who are high-performing by accident ended up in a different team. Like, this doesn't really make sense. So probably it's not about the people in the team, but about the constraints around the team, what kind of support is provided to them, and so on. So fix that. So don't try to fix the people, don't try to fix the team, but fix the context, the surroundings for that team, and let them deliver what they actually are capable of delivering, not what they're forced into, like in a corner.
But I think that we now have came to the end of our time. It was really delightful to discuss
Indeed.
with you. And thanks a lot, Kaimar Karu. And let's see when we can have sometimes maybe another episode.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.